Hello, this video is about DNA and information and why random processes cannot create functional information. It's the first video in the series. What we'll do in this video is we'll represent DNA as HTML. Now, HTML is a kind of a computer programming language that helps us see things within a browser. We'll walk you through computer programs that modify character sequences. The code will modify our DNA, modeling evolution. Then we'll do some scientific experiments to confirm or deny the hypothesis that random processes can generate functional information. The basic requirements of common descent. The debate about evolution is not about alleles or variation. To think so is to misunderstand the different types of informational structures. It's about a change in kind. Informationally, it's about an increase in function. DNA, the basis of life, is an informational construct. To understand it, we need to have a strong understanding of information. Natural processes must be able to modify DNA, but that's not enough. They must create new functional information, and they must create superior functional information. Otherwise, there's no growth in the organisms. Now, before we begin, I will show you all the computer code, but I will not teach you all about computer programming. We will be using Java and HTML. If you just want to follow along, you'll begin to understand how functional information works. If you want to do the studies yourself, you can Google for any of the details I don't cover, and it's a lot of fun. All right, so let's get started. So the first thing that we're going to do, we're just going to double click on the Parent.html, and that will bring up in the browser, here I'm using Chrome, the result of the Parent.html. So Parent.html is just a file that generates some images on the screen in the browser. So as we look at this, this is essentially equivalent to a biologist looking at the organisms around them, because they can only see from the outside. But as we've understood DNA, we can understand what actually causes these things to be the way they are. So what does this look like internally? Now I've brought up parent easy to read.html. That's the same as parent.html except for some spacing, and just to make it easier to read. And so this is what it looks like. SVG means scalable vector graphics. I'm not going to go into every detail of everything, just going to show you the basics. So you can see that we've got a circle here, a rectangle, and then this path. That path represents that pentagon shape here. And so we've got some positions for the circle. There's a center of the circle, X and Y, and a radius. For the rectangle, there's an X and a Y position plus a width and a height. And for the path, there's a whole bunch of numbers there, followed by a whole bunch of other commands. So we won't get into that, but that's that pentagon shape, and that's all that is. The parent looks exactly the same, except for I've just gotten rid of spaces, so that everything is all on one line, and you can see that right here. Now, there's one other thing that I'll note is that if you can look down here at the bottom, you see 340 column 340. So that means that the number of characters is one less than that. It's 339, and that is divisible by 3. And that's an important thing here. I explicitly put in a space in order so that it could be divisible by 3. And the reason is that DNA in biological systems encode for amino acids. And so each amino acid is represented by 3 base pairs. So if we divide 339 by 3, we get 113 amino acids. And so the amino acids work together to form proteins. And so this would be a protein that's only got 113 amino acids. The typical protein in biological systems is about 300 amino acids. So this parent.html would be a very small protein. So this sequence of characters models DNA. And just like in a biological system, you have biological machines that process your DNA. They run along the DNA and process it to actually create living beings. So in a similar way, this code here, computers process this code to generate the result that we see, which is this set of shapes. So now we're going to talk about the program reproduceHtml.java that is going to be used to actually model evolutionary reproduction by taking the Parent.html and modifying that. Now, as a quick aside, I'm using Visual Studio Code, and you can download that, but you can also use any type of text editor. But it needs to be, the name that you save it as is very important in Java. Here this is Notepad++, but you can use anything that saves a text file. Here I'm going to go back and use Visual Studio Code because that's my preference. Here, if you're going to copy this, an easy way to do this is just to pause the video and you can just type in the information exactly as you see it here. And it has to be exact, and that is actually probably one of the most obvious things to show that random mutations of DNA is just not going to create information. It's just going to cause lots of trouble. But we're going to actually walk through and give it a try and do a scientific experiment. So here, the name of the file needs to match what is called the class here, and we'll get to that in just a second. And notice that that is reproduceHtml in the case matters. And the only difference for the file is named the same thing but has a .java. It can't be .text, it has to be .java. So this is a Java program, and the first line here imports Java.io. That's a set of code that is written by others. It's you can call it a library if you want, and it allows us to do certain things. It gives us the ability to do certain things, such as to be able to read information in from another file and to modify things. Here we have Java util.random, and that allows us to do random number generation. We'll use that to randomly mutate things. So we have here public class, and so this is kind of defining the program, the reproduceHtml program. And the first thing we see is some variables. So computer programs are kind of like sentences, but they're quite different in a very important way. They are able to have variables. So here this parent DNA or the child DNA, and variables are extremely important in understanding why evolution is not true and why it is that when you see variation in the children, it doesn't have to do with modifying the DNA itself. It has to do with a substitution of variables, and those are called genes. But we won't talk about that in too much detail here because we're going to do scientific experiments based upon the hypothesis that you can just simply modify a sequence of characters. So here we have the first string, which is parent.dna. That's a variable to represent the parent's DNA. So we will load in the information in parent.html into this variable parent.dna. And we will then modify it to create the child's DNA, and then we'll write that out as a child.html. Now, this valid characters here is the set of potential characters that you can replace these. And so it's kind of like saying that in DNA, the base pairs, the different values that you can have for those base pairs. Now, in DNA, you only have 4 bases: adenine, cytosine, guanine, or thymine. But here we're actually using a computer program, so we have to represent many different characters here. Now, in Java programs, you always have this main area here, this main function, and so that's where everything will run. Again, I'm not going to explain all the details of why these things are here. You can Google Java and learn about these different things, but if you type in exactly what you see, it will run. So this is starting the program, and we put this in a try catch block to catch any errors. That's what that's about. We have a buffered writer out file, so this is going to output some information. We have a buffered reader, so we're going to read information from a file. And our first file that we're going to read from, you use this syntax, in file equals new buffered reader, so you're going to read from an input stream reader, and that's going to be a file input stream called Parent.html. So this whole line here is maybe seems a little complicated, but it's allowing us to read in a specific file. So this may seem a bit complicated right now, but the reason it is because Java does a lot of reusability. It reuses functionality. And that's another reason that evolutionary arguments of things like vestigial organs or things that are common between different animals or different types of organisms is not a valid argument from an informational perspective, because within computer systems, for example, you reuse functionality in many different ways. So let's get back to the parent DNA. We've got this file, we're telling it we want to read from this file, and we read in that line. So that's why in Parent.html it's on one line, just so that it's easier to read that single line. Now you can, if you had multiple lines in a file, you can read multiple lines, but that requires more computer knowledge, and we're just making it simple here. Plus, the way that we think of DNA is just one long strand of information. So you read that information in, and then we just close it off to close that file. Now we're going to randomly generate a number, and then we will use that number to actually change a place in the parent's DNA. Now this thing here, this line here, is trying to determine where in the parent's DNA we're going to make the change. And so that's what this mutation location is about. So we generate some position. So we're not generating the character that we're going to replace it with, we're generating the location in which we're going to change a character. Now, there's other kind of mutations that you can do as well. You can do insert or delete and any of those kinds of things. So if you want to do that, you can try that. But we're going to start with a very basic type of mutation. So here we're going to do the mutation. What mutation do we want to do? So first we're going to find out the mutation location, then we're going to find out the mutation. So what we'll do is we'll pick one of these characters, and so that's the set of valid characters, and we'll choose a character at some random location. And so we'll pick one of those characters. Then the next thing we'll do is we're going to take that mutation, and this whole set of information here is telling it to take the parent's DNA, and at some location, this location from the parent's DNA, at that location we are going to replace that character with this mutated character, and then copy out the rest of the string. So we'll just substitute one character. So this is only substituting one character at this mutation location. Then what we will do is this line here just opens up a new file, just kind of like your word processor was going to save something. So it's going to open up this new file, and it's going to output to child.html. Again, if you want to do this yourself, all you have to do is type in the code exactly as you see. And then finally we'll close the file. And the very last thing that we do is print out any errors that might occur. So in summary, this file simply reads in a file called Parent.html, makes a modification to one character, and writes it out as a separate file called child.html. Now, the HTML files are easy because in order to actually see the results of those files, all you have to do is double-click on them. So, for example, parent, if I wanted to see that, I can just double-click on that, and it will come up in a browser so I can see the result. Java is a little bit different than that. Java, you have to compile. So let's understand a little bit about what compiling is. Basically, it means that I can't just use Java code as it is. I have to process it in a type of way. So, for example, we have the reproduceHtml file, html.java file. What I need to do is type in Java C, so you can do this on your system if you have Java installed. And that means Java compile reproduce, and I will actually let it complete. So Java C reproduceHtml.java. And what that does is that processes the program and makes it understandable by the machine. We'll talk about why that's important later. But for right now, what we've done is made this program executable. So now if I want to run the program, all I have to do is type in Java, not Java C, but Java, and reproduceHtml, and class is the file that was created by compiling the Java file. But I don't want to keep that extension. I remove all extensions, and that will now run the reproduceHtml program. And when it does that, what it has done has read in the Parent.html and created a child HTML file. So let's bring up the browser again and look at that. So when we bring up the child.html file, we see that, there's a slight difference right here. It looks like it's shortening up a little bit. And you compare it to the parent, a little bit different there. Now I'm going to show another thing. I'm going to come over here. This is Chrome. You can use other browsers as well, but in Chrome you can select more tools, developer tools, and we'll do that so we can see kind of some things that are going on here. You can see what the child looks like. You may or may not be easy to see things. We'll look at this a little bit more in a second, but you notice that there's an error here. So it expected a number, but it didn't get a number. So there's actually an error, and that's almost like cancer or some other kind of problem that you might have. You still are able to survive, but there's a problem. Now, to see exactly what the change was, I have a file comparison tool. It's called MELD. You can use any number of comparison tools. It compares one file to another. And if we scroll along, we see that at this location here, which happens to be at column 282, this next character used to be a 3. It's a 3 in the parent, but it becomes an H in the child. So that's the mutation that occurred. So you can use a tool like that to compare them, and then you could scroll over and see that same thing in this part here, but we're not going to take that time. But so that's what happened here. So now, instead of me telling you that something will or will not work, we can use the scientific method to test whether or not things can work. So the hypothesis of evolution is that natural processes or random mutations can actually create functional information. So here we have a parent, and we look at the child. So did this become functionally better? Well, actually, it degraded it a little bit. You got an error here, and you lost some information. And that's actually what we see in biology, is that mutations result in loss of information. And even if sometimes they can be beneficial. So you may ask how a loss of information can actually be beneficial. Well, a good example is in antibiotics and bacteria. So, for example, if antibiotics are used to attack bacteria, it's attacking a functionality that exists in the bacteria. But if there's a mutation that removes that functionality of the bacterium, then that bacterium is no longer adversely affected by the antibiotic. So that has a beneficial outcome, even though it's a loss of information. So our first experiment negated the evolutionary hypothesis that random processes can create functional information. So let's now try another experiment and repeat it. And let's look and see what the result is there. So I just bring up the child and I'll refresh the screen and see, oh, wow, that's quite a bit of a change there. So again, it negates the hypothesis. So let's run it again. And let's see what the result is. Again, we lost information. We have two shapes, but the third shape is missing. And you can continue to run this over and over again to see the results that you will get. Now, sometimes you will actually see all of the same shapes. There seems to be no visible appearance of any loss. But when you look at and compare the child to the parent, such as through this file comparison, you'll see that the information is degraded. And that's probably even a better term, because you can actually increase the number of characters. So when I say loss, I don't mean that it's fewer characters. I mean the quality of the information is degraded. Okay, so we have tried just single or point mutations here. Why don't we try to do more mutations and see what the result is there? So now we will create a new program called reproduceHtml.java. So it's going to be almost exactly the same as reproduceHtml. Ironically, notice that we're not using natural processes to modify this file. We're using intelligence to modify this file. And still, if you try it yourself, you'll find out that even with using intelligence, it actually turns out that it's kind of difficult to get things to work properly. So let's take a look at this. It's pretty much the same all the way down here. And after the after the random number generation right here, we're going to change things a little bit in this section right here. So let's look at the reproduce.html, and you see that we read the file in, we close the file, and we have a random number generator here, right there. And then the next line is where we're going to change things a little bit. Now what we'll do is we're going to copy the parent to the child, an exact clone, if you will, and then we're going to modify it based upon the parent's length. This is called a for loop, and so it will do something a certain number of times. It'll start with 0, and it will do a certain number of times, incrementing by 1 each time, and so it will keep doing this. So what it's going to do, it's going to find the parent's length, how long that parent string is, and it's going to divide it by 10. So 10% of the characters in that string will get modified. So it's only 10% that we're randomly changing, and so we will randomly change. And these strings here, these instructions are pretty much the same as what we had in reproduce.html, and the rest of them are the same, and we will output the child. So we go back to our command line, and this time we will compile that program, Java C, reproduce HTML multi.java. So we compile that program, and again it was successful. You may find that it's not successful, again showing that random mutations fight against the creation of functional information. But this one worked because it was typed in properly, and I already debugged it. So now what we're going to do is run it in the same way we did the other one. Java reproduce HTML multi, and again we get rid of that extension. And so it has now done a number of mutations to the child. So now when I go back to the child and refresh the screen, I see something really strange. And you might think that this is actually increasing the functionality because we have these characters and everything else like that. But really what's happened is that this is such a bad set of mutations that we don't even see the shapes there. And if I bring up the file comparison program, you can see the changes. And first of all, it doesn't even know that there's any shapes because the SVG is gone and there's no rectangle, and there's lots of other issues here. So what the browser is doing is it can't even make heads or tails of it, so it just thinks that this is a bunch of characters to put up on the screen. So that's not anything that the child is doing, it's what the browser is doing. It's as if it's just showing us the dead body of the child. So again, this experiment refutes the hypothesis. But maybe that's just that one time, so let's try it again. And that's the good thing about the scientific method. It needs to be repeatable, and so let's try it again. Run that, and refresh the screen. And nothing even shows up at all. How about we try it again? So you can continue to do this just like for the other program. And again, we've got errors. Nothing's even showing up, so it surely is not creating new functional information. So we're nearing the end of this video. Let's summarize a little bit. We started off with this Parent.html with a number of shapes here. And the intention is to try to let natural processes improve this parent so that the child becomes better and better. Unfortunately, every experiment we did with the first program, which is a single point mutation, didn't improve things, and it degraded it. And then we thought, well, let's try some more mutations, but that made it even worse. So you should see that more mutations cause more problems. But still, we've only been looking at the outside and subjectively judging whether or not the child is superior. In our next video, we're going to actually try to compile the program, and that gives us a very exact way to see whether or not the child is superior and can function. And in fact, if the child doesn't function, it's equivalent to being dead, because that's what a living being does. It functions, and that's the thing that we're concerned about. We're not concerned about just adding more characters or changing things. What we want to see is, are we able to increase functionality? So let's talk about that a little bit. To illustrate a little bit what we mean by functional information, I've created another file called functional child example, which is exactly the same as the parent, but at the end of it, I've added a little bit of other information, starting with the word button here. And it says button, one click, hello, click me, button, script, and then it has this word function, hello, and an alert. So this is a thing that actually puts a button up and does something. So let's take a look at that. So when we bring up the functional child, we have a little button here, and if I click on it, it says this page says hello. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking for in terms of if common descent is true, we have to increase functionality, not just have things that have pretty patterns or something that looks interesting. It actually has to be able to do things, to accomplish things. So if you'd like to learn more, check out the next video where we go to the next step and you can learn some more programming. Now, at this point in time, you may be wondering, okay, well, if this is true, then how is it that we get variation between the parent and the child? And we'll discuss that in later videos. But the key point is, it's not the way that evolutionists think. It's not mutations of the DNA string, except for there are mutations that are resulting in really bad things such as cancer and disease. That's not what is producing variation between the parent and the child. But beyond that, one of the main takeaways that I'd like you to get from this video is to be able to do experiments yourself. If you don't believe me, that's fine. Give it a try and do it yourself. But don't just take someone's word for it. Do the experiments. That's what science is about. So I hope that's helpful, and you can give it a try yourself if you want to. To learn more, just check out the other videos.